بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على النبي الكريم محمد وعلى آله الطيبين والصحبه الصالحين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm usually based in England. Obviously I live in England, but I'm actually currently doing this lecture from Pakistan, Lahore to be precise. So from London to Lahore, although when I go to see my family, sometimes based in Lisbon, so I only go to cities that have an L at the beginning of them. Let's see. Okay, khair inshallah. So some good news and bad news, which is I actually prepared some slides, and for some reason, in transit, they've all been corrupted, so my PowerPoint is not working. Fortunately, I have my lecture written up in a Word document, but I was going to present it as slides. So unfortunately, you're just going to have to hear me jabber on a bit, if that's okay with you guys. But I will try to help you visualize what I was talking about. So mostly it was just basically images of inventions that Muslims have made and contributions that Muslims have done in the past. But inshallah, we will get to that. So the lecture today is about the heritage of Islam. And one of the key issues that Muslims try to kind of, discuss in modern discourses is they try to, in essence, try to show that Islam is somehow useful. And because in a materialist society, what is materially useful is deemed to be morally but good, even if the uses are disputable. Muslims seem to kind of try to say, well, Islam has some benefit to it. It has some moral good to it because look, it brings technological development in some way. Now, in of itself, as a principle, that's not the basis for good, bad. I mean, yes, I'm going to show that Islam obviously led to technological advances, but it's not the measure of good and bad. If you'd like to use that as a criteria, then we can apply it to other civilizations, other peoples, which you probably would disagree with. So during World War II, one country that was very advanced in its science and technology, developing rocket technology, working on actually nuclear weapons before even the Allies did. And to the point that the Allies used the scientists of this country to build their nuclear weapons and also their missile and rocket programs. Which country is this? Of course, it's Nazi Germany. Now, just because Nazi Germany had some advanced technology, I mean, they had the Tiger tank, which was a very advanced tank. They couldn't make many of them, but they were really advanced, sloped armor, very modern, you could say. It beat the best that the Allies had to offer in terms of tank technology. Does it mean that they're better now? Does it mean they're morally good just because they have advanced technology and they were able to actually be more advanced than the Allies in World War II? Well, no, it doesn't. Certainly does not. And this is where obviously we have to be careful how we argue these things. Some people might say, well, religion is an impediment to science and development. Well, the Nazis could say that in their concentration camps, they conducted obviously involuntary human experiments. And if you were to argue against this, they'll say, well, you're impeding science because we learn so much if we can actually experiment on humans in very horrific ways, but we can actually learn scientific knowledge. So then, is someone that has less moral scruples better than someone that has more moral scruples? Because less moral scruples allows you less limits in investigating scientific questions. Because clearly, then someone who has no limits as to what they can do, what biological experiments they can do, will probably be able to do more experimentation and therefore possibly gain more knowledge than someone that has limitations about animal cruelty and, of course, not experimenting on human beings, uh, obviously involuntarily and in the manners that the Nazi scientists did. So, is this the basis for us to judge what is good and bad? It isn't. However, it's the Islamic worldview and mindset was always one which didn't argue that you must have new technology for new technology's sake, but rather there has to be a purpose behind it. There must be a reason for anything we are trying to do with society. And the Islamic understanding, the Islamic worldview, was one about gaining the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the universe, by doing the things which we believe please him, such as being merciful, helping people, helping the poor, helping the sick, trying to bring ease to society, remove burdens, remove stress, remove impediments to people's lives, making life easier. These were things which we did not for their own sake, but because we were trying to worship Allah. So I'm gonna return back to that mindset, that mentality, and just discuss kind of what happened in the in Islamic history, and then we're gonna go and look at towards the end what happened, what went wrong, and what does the Quran actually teach, and how can we basically recover that mindset today, because that's very, very important. So let's go and look at in terms of Islamic civilization. So from the 7th century, uh, the forces of Islam spread, and you had these two major regional powers, but in some sense, world powers. You had the Persian Empire, which was at a key crossroads in the world, and then you had the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire split in two, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. The Eastern Roman Empire never collapsed. There was no collapse with them. Where Muslims were able to obtain the books of Greek philosophy was from the records and the storage and maintenance of these texts and literature from East Roman imperial sources. So it was the Eastern Romans that had preserved these Greek texts because they were Greek speakers, right? The Western Roman Empire was the Latin speakers, but the Eastern Roman Empire were the Greek speakers. So they had preserved these things, but it didn't seem to create any renaissance or with the Eastern Roman Empire. They were rather stagnant, although better and more advanced than West European barbarians at the time, which was that had taken over the remnants of the Western Roman Empire, these Germanic barbarians, which didn't seem to know how to maintain Roman technology that had been left behind, maintenance of aqueducts, maintenance of certainly couldn't maintain the steam rooms and the valves and all this stuff. They couldn't maintain any of these things. So these things fell into disrepair over time. So these Western Roman Germanic, so these Germanic barbarians will come to them in a second. So then what Muslims did as a policy from the time of Umar, when he was the second Caliph of Islam. So under his tenure as the Caliph of the Muslims, the leader of the Muslims, he oversaw the defeat of the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. So then what did the Muslims do when they encountered the Persians and Romans and they have taken over the land? So firstly, it was defeating them militarily. There was no kicking people out of their lands. There was no colonization. There was no forced conversion to Islam. There was not even changing the laws of that Christians or the Persians or Zoroastrians were living under, because the Islamic principle is to not interfere with people's lives who are not Muslim. So if they don't follow Islam or they don't believe in Islam, then you can't tell them how to live their lives or what to do, or even what laws they're going to be under in terms of the laws of their community that they had been enjoying previously. But rather, you offer them a very minimum basic citizenship, which is basically you pay a citizenship tax, as a contract citizen, and you get protection in return. So you get the police, and you get you get the soldiers guarding the borders. This is the modern foundation of all kind of states, by the way. So people might say, well, I don't, this is an outrage. How dare you ask us for tax in return for protection? This is such a barbaric medieval mindset. So no, this is actually the modern world. The modern concept of the citizen is contract citizens. You pay tax to the government. The government can ask you for that tax because in return, the government then protects you. They fund the police force, they fund the armies, and by extension, the fire brigade, the fire departments, and depending on which country you're in, of course, the health service. But that doesn't. It's not always uniform for every Western country. Americans who are watching will tell us about this. But anyway, so you're all contract citizens anyway. And so in essence, the Arabic word, the dhimma, it applies to all of you. You're all dhimma of your governments, whichever government you're in. You must pay them tax as soon as you start earning money. So that was what Islam offered them. Now, Islam didn't view the learning of different civilizations as an anathema, as something heretical, what have you, because as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, hikmah, so wisdom, is the lost property of the believer. If he finds it, he's the most entitled to it, which means that wisdom can come from anywhere. And in essence, we treat it as like a lost property that belongs to us, in the sense of, if someone is making a discovery about the natural world, which is the world that the creator of the universe created, of course, if he's doing something that's very efficient, if he's developing some process, some procedure to manage the people, to take care of the people, that actually works, then as Muslims, we view ourselves as more entitled, you could say, to, in essence, imitate that, right? So meaning we copy it. If it works well, we should do it ourselves, in essence, basically. So there was no reticence for Muslims to actually take what worked and what they found that worked. And you would be surprised. And I was going to show, I had all these pictures and everything prepared. So maybe when this video is published, I'll take the video and I'll basically superimpose the pictures that I had in mind on this. But anyway, so you're going to be shocked at some things you think are Islamic, but where they actually came from. So Umar radiallahu anhu, he was the caliph of the Muslims, and he saw the Persians had a method of accounting called diwan, which was a way of managing the economics of the state, basically. In essence, the department, the treasury, and how to allocate funds in a very efficient manner to different areas, departments, and things. So he borrowed it. He took it from the Persian Empire. So this works very well. We should use it because it achieves the objective in the most efficient way. Right? The Quran commands us to exercise hikmah. And what is hikmah? Right? It's translated as wisdom, but what is wisdom? Right? And many Muslims actually don't ask this question, which is one of the problems I'll get to as to what happened later to Muslim civilization. So we don't know the definitions of these words, and hence we don't actually then know how to enact the commands of the Quran. So what is hikmah? So hikmah, you could say discernment or judgment, but it is basically a judgment in what? Right? So if you're doing something, discernment or judgment means knowing the best way to do something, which is the most efficient way. So to achieve the objective with the least effort possible. In essence, being efficient, right? Not doing extra effort when actually just doing the right amount of effort to achieve the objective in the best possible way, and make it long lasting, the results and the effects. So this is what hikmah and discernment. So the Quran commands Muslims to manage the affairs of the people and it gives specific commands, and as also the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which for those of you who are not Muslim here, I'm going to generalize this. It's not exactly how it is, but in essence, the Quran, while it does give very specific commands, it might give, you could say, general commands, which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam explains in detail practically. So some people say, in one way, in looking at commandments, the Quran is the theoretical, and the Sunnah, the narrations, the actions, the abstentions. So by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the practice, it's the practical aspect. It's a generalization. It's not exactly uh, um, accurate, but if it just helps you understand why, because the Quran and why we have the Hadith and the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the practices of the Prophet Muhammad sallam and his commands and his explanations of the Quran. Why we have these two sources. So what we see is the Sunnah and the Quran commands Muslims to achieve very specific goals when it comes to society, which is to ensure that, of course, no one goes hungry, everyone has food, clothing, and shelter. There's many narrations which I can get into, but there's many narrations by the Prophet Muhammad sallam, which is so that, for example, the son of Adam has no better right than clothing to put in his back, to clothe his nakedness, food to feed him, and water, to drink. Another narration talks about things like shelter and heat. So, for example, access to energy, basically. So these are from the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad. So as Muslims, then we have to consider how to achieve this in the best possible way using the technological means at hand. So the Prophet Muhammad taught this, that the leaders of the Muslims that came after the Prophet Muhammad, which is that the caliphs, the successors to the Prophet Muhammad, not as prophets, but successorship to him as the leader of the United Muslim State, right, the Jama'ah. They then took this forward. So Umar Anhum took the idea of the Diwan system. But there are other things that were taken from these two civilizations, the Romans and the Persians. So when you look at a mosque, right, what do you imagine? What do you see? Right. So you usually see, you might see a dome, which is quite common. You might see those pointed tipped arches, right, which is very kind of idiosyncratic of what is called Islamic architecture, and you might imagine. Well, you'd be surprised to know that both those things were actually taken from the Romans. So Romans had domes. They had domes in churches and their buildings before. You know, the first mosques had domes. The first mosques were very basic. They're usually just kind of like flat roofed, basically. Like, so you see sometimes not thatched roofs, sorry, but in a sense using palm fibers and palm trees to make it so a basic flat roof, because at the time of the Prophet, the Arabs in Arabia, that was the best that they could do, or they understood to make roofing, basically. So usually wooden constructions and just flat. But then it was seen that, well, look, the Romans have this construction of domes, and these domes all are quite useful for expanding the space above, maybe better for acoustics, maybe good for cooling. So then the Muslims borrowed the idea of just making domes. They improved upon it, of course, but they borrowed it. Now, the idea of arches, well, again, you can see in Eastern Roman churches or Eastern Orthodox churches, the idea they have the arches, but Muslims actually developed or improved upon the general arch by making it more tipped, which they saw distributed the weight that was coming down on the arch better towards the sides by doing that. So it distributes weight better. So they took an idea that was already existent, and they simply improved upon it to develop what you might now see. Of course, in the western part of Islamic civilization, that kind of arches was there, but they actually more preferred horseshoe arches. So you might see in Morocco, and you might see in the palaces and old mosques and old castles that belong to the Muslims in Spain and Portugal, where I'm from, Portugal that is, not Spain. You'll see horseshoe arches that were used as the form of arches for buildings, and that gave it its iconic style. So these things are actually not intrinsically Islamic. They were just technological innovations that worked and enhanced the places of worship, especially it helped cooling in terms of the domes, and Muslims improved the size of the domes they could make, and even make the domes themselves pointy on the top, which is a little bit more tricky to do than the basic Roman domes. So these are types of architecture that Muslims took on board, but they didn't just stop there. There is a whole list of inventors that basically wanted to solve problems, practical problems that people face, wanted to improve society, and in essence try to make people's lives easier. So one of the issues was you might see astrolabes are a very common instrument, which is usually when you see, Islamic civilization, you see, an astrolabe with Arabic writing on it, and I had some nice images there. So an astrolabe is it's basically like a circular, it looks like a massive pendant, right? It's a big circular brass thing with another wheel around it, which you can turn like a watch, basically the watch, rims. You can turn it, and what you do is you hold it up and you basically look at the night sky. You compare it to stars, and then you turn it towards. It basically makes the calculation as to, in essence, using the map of the stars, and of course it is constructed using star chart knowledge. It would tell you your position on planet Earth. Right? So it's used for navigation. It's also used to tell you the time of day. So Muslims developed the idea of they developed the astrolabe. Um, Now, it didn't mean that there didn't exist an astrolabe of some kind before, or Muslims developed it. But what Muslims did is, like many things, they took something that was already there and they made a more sophisticated, more a much more improved version, which was able to do calculations. So in essence, it was a calculator, it was a GPS for its time, as well as a timepiece, in essence, using stars, using the sun and moon and so on and so forth, in order to give you your the time of day that wherever you are. So it was a very useful device. So now people might say, well, Muslims didn't invent the astrolabe, so why is it something that is attributed to Muslims? However, the thing is, there are many things which have been developed by even and this is what some people were. I was told before this lecture. It's a question that often people ask is, how do you attribute technology to some civilizational people? Well, usually you attribute it to those either where it arose from, or where the modern version has been developed from an improvement. So where there's a significant improvement that's been made on that technology, which wasn't made before. So one example is, when the British came to China and they brought timepieces, right? They brought these, mechanical clocks to China, and they were, in essence, kind of viewing themselves as more superior because they had these mechanical clocks. But look at the Chinese, they don't have mechanical clocks, which the Europeans had. However, the Chinese actually were the ones who developed, you could say, the first kind of clocks, which would later pass through Muslim civilization and go to the West. Then the West would then improve on it and develop it into the more modern, you could say, mechanical device that we've seen. So they were kind of selling them back to the Chinese, even though the Chinese, in essence, came up with the idea. So who invented the clock then? Who can be attributed as the inventors of the clocks? Usually what you see is these ideas seem to spring up spontaneously in Europe, in the history classes, how you're taught these things. They just spontaneously turn up in Europe, and that's it. It comes from Europe. Europeans invented it. Whereas what you'll find is that Europeans actually were swimming in ideas and technology they came that came to them from many other civilizations around them and by trade. And then it just became um, uh, accepted, and then eventually they started to improve on it. But anyway, let's go back to obviously Islamic inventions and devices. So what we see is there was some very fascinating things you might see, you could say. You could say that the idea of the first robotics was developed by Muslims. So Al-Jazairi was a Muslim inventor from 1136 to 1206. He designed automatic machines, including kitchen appliances, musical automata powered by water. So in essence, you'd have a type of boat that was powered by water, which would basically have music played at certain intervals, percussion and what have you. And if you could reprogram it by moving the notches around that are triggered, that cause these mechanical sounds to be played. So it's actually a reprogrammable robot. Yes, there was no electricity involved, but the premise is certainly there. Of course, no one would attribute robotics to, the Muslims, but in essence, these books would be written on ingenious devices, which would eventually be translated into Latin and eventually be taught at the first universities in the West in the 11 to 12 to 1300s. And there was a great translation movement into Arabic language, where there were Arabic to Latin, which would make accessible all these books and literature and would inspire Europeans to basically make improvements to their own society. We see there was scientists like Ibn Nafs and Ibn Khuf who described blood circulation and the function of the heart valves in the 13th century, and it would take 300 years before Europe later discovered it for themselves. In the 13th century, Al-Zahrawi and Ibn Zuhr would use inhalation anesthesia, so get a sponge laced with various drugs and opiates that you would place on the patient's face to knock them out, so then you could operate on them without them feeling pain. 600 years later, the American C. Long would be credited with that discovery. So he would be credited the idea of anesthesia to someone centuries later. The idea of hospitals. Now, hospitals were not something that Muslims invented, but the idea of specialized places which would have departments or wards, the idea of wards within hospitals and dispensaries, giving out free medicine to patients. And with each ward having a specialized illness to treat was certainly an invention that Muslims came up with, an improvement that Muslims came up with. But other things that were basically, in essence, discovered by Muslims or developed by Muslims, the treatment of cataracts, thought to be untreatable, where your lens develops, in essence, cloudy substance that basically begins to cloud your vision, and then eventually you're not able to see out of the eye. It's just cloudy. It looks like fog. You might see lights, but nothing else. So the actual removal of cataracts with surgical instruments, so developing surgical instruments and processes that can treat cataracts. The idea of these hospitals actually having patient records, so that you'd go in and they would look at your previous records. You wouldn't have to tell the doctors again what your problems are. Some people might say, depending on which health service you're using, is these days that needs to be brought back because it seems like some of the Western healthcare systems are breaking down and are not efficient anymore. The idea of mending bone fractures and understanding bone fractures and improving the treatment of them. The actual looking at the anatomy of the eye to correctly describe how the eye actually works, to correctly describe how light actually works, which is also a separate thing. It was believed that light is emitted by the eyes in some way, or vision is emitted by the eyes, and that's how you see. Whereas, which was actually a Greek theory, ancient Greek theory, or when Muslims actually refuted it, say no, it depends on light reflection, and it gets picked up by eyes, and it's it hits the back of your eye, and that's how vision works. They didn't know exactly about neurons and photosensitive cells and things like this, but they understood that it was something that to do with how the back of the eye receives it, and then it gets passed via the nerves that go to the brain. They didn't know how it happened because it was a basic appraisal at the time, but to understand how nerve conduction, electricity, they didn't know that just yet, but they certainly understood that it was vision occurs by that process, a general process. Vaccinations and inoculations, so treating people using, for example, the if someone is ill, some of their illnesses might create pus. So using that pus to then infect other people, which contains the antibodies and might contain dead bacteria from a person who's diseased, can be used to inoculate and vaccinate people. So that was certainly something that was developed by Muslims. They didn't have a theory of germs. They didn't understand that, but they just saw that it seemed to be an effective way to reduce the severity of the disease in someone, and then they don't seem to reacquire that disease afterwards. There was a huge development of pharmacy and drugs and so on to treat a variety of ailments. There was medical journals and encyclopedias were basically developed and written down concerning the practice of medicine. And some of these became textbooks that were taught in Western universities for centuries later. So these were Arabic books that were taught from centuries later. So this is where we see Islamic, you could say, sciences that were developed by Muslims later on still had impact in the West, and that the West was actually still using it for some time until they then later on improved upon those kind of developments. So what we see then is that Muslim world wasn't just stagnant and just stuck in time, you could say, and was not developing. They were certainly expanding the boundaries of human knowledge, and they were basically trying to understand where the problems that kind of beset human beings come from, and trying to develop solutions to it. Now, as for things in physics, there is a lot of scientists that kind of expanded the boundaries. So there was, for example, the famous scientist Ali Hassan ibn al-Haytham, who wrote a very famous book called Kitab al-Manazir, which discussed optics and light quite accurately, and he developed the scientific method by experimentation. And now, many humans experiment, right? It's actually natural for humans to try something out. No one invents the idea of experimentation, but the idea that experimentation should be part of the learning process for a systematic study of the natural world is something that was a brand new kind of idea. So usually at this time, everyone thought that the ancient Greeks had discovered everything, and simply was just to apply their knowledge that they have passed down and to take their word for it when they describe things, what have you. But Ibn Haytham argued that you shouldn't just take it blindly, because how do you know? They made mistakes. Maybe they went on superstitions or speculation. So he said he's not going to believe in anything with certainty in terms of the natural world until he has tested it. So it was believed at his time that light did travel in a straight line, but he said, I'm not going to accept that until I actually test it. So then he actually, made turned a room into a camera obscura, made a hole in the wall, and kind of saw how light would shine out of that in this dark room, which is the basis for actually how cameras were first invented, by the way. But he wasn't making a camera, and he saw that light did indeed travel in a straight line. Then he said, okay, well, now I've established that by experiment, I can say it is true now because I've experimented and I've established that myself. So that was a very revolutionary idea, and that would go on to influence Roger Bacon, and then later on Francis Bacon, not related, by the way, they're not related, with the idea of the scientific method, the idea of experimentation as the basis for knowledge of physical things, of the natural world. We see now this brings a question as to what can be attributed to Muslims and what can't be attributed to Muslims. So, for example, Ibn Faras tested a flying machine 700 years before Leonardo da Vinci conceived of his own flying machines that he could design. So he's from. Now, this was obviously 9th century figure. Now, can Muslims be attributed with inventing the idea of flight? Well, I would say no, because nothing came of that. Now, whether, or rather, we have no evidence to show that basically inspired Leonardo da Vinci to basically develop flying machines of himself. It might be just a case that 700 years later, he just came up with a similar inspired idea. Although some people have noticed that Leonardo da Vinci's works resemble a North African kind of inventor that came roughly before Leonardo da Vinci and had his own designs written down. And, there's a resemblance. Is it coincidence? Did Leonardo da Vinci, who lives obviously in Italy, so it's in the Mediterranean, did he somehow acquire these texts? I was inspired by them. Now, this is where speculation starts to happen. But some people have noticed that it could be possible that he was inspired by the speculative technological texts and drawings and designs of thinkers from North Africa at the time, which were obviously Muslim. You had things that Muslim developed, like the process of distillation. Now, for anyone who doesn't do chemistry, distillation is a kind of you get a round flask that has a kind of opening at the top funnel, and you put something in it and you basically boil it up, and the way it's shaped and so on, it basically separates liquids into their component layers. So if a liquid is made of a mix of something, it starts to separate into layers, and the actual receptacle, the main receptacle, is called the alembic. This is the name that it has today, which is from the Arabic alambic, where that is something that did come from the Muslims did invent it. I call it the medieval version of the atomic particle smasher, because at the time it was used to look at what things are made out of, because it seemed to be able to break things apart. And there were some records of over-enthusiastic individuals using this to actually, they put a frog in it and see what the frog's made out of, which is rather cruel. Well, maybe presumably the frog was already dead, but it was viewed as very revolutionary because it could basically give you constituent chemicals from mixtures. And so it would separate the mixtures out. Then you could basically remove the mixtures to get the particular well, I won't say element, but the particular composite liquid that you wanted from something. And in a sense, we use distillation from hydrocarbons to produce the variety of petroleum and benzene and so on. So we use in essence distillation process today to actually from this mixture from oil. Basically, you don't put oil in your car apart from lubrication, but oil needs to be distilled into its different constituents, and then depending on the engine that you have, you use one particular constituent, like petrol, for example, or you might use diesel, for example, or paraffin, which if you're a jet engine, for example. So This was one of the things that Muslims actually did develop, and the name is still retained in it. Uh, in the actual thing that is still used by chemists today. It's actually still used by chemists today, so it's actually still in use. Um, there was something that was very difficult in the ancient world, which was writing. In the ancient world, when you wanted to write something, you had to get parchment, or so papyrus, usually reed, which you have to flatten out. It's a very laborious process, and you can write on one side, but on the other side, it's very veiny because it all has the reeds and stalks and things on that side. So it's actually, if you had to use the other side, it was not easy to write because the paper was uneven. But that was, well, it wasn't called paper. It's not called parchment. Isn't paper. It was very expensive and time consuming way to make writable materials. So while paper making actually comes from China, what Muslims did is it was still a very laborious process to make paper. It was very hard process. And it wasn't used um, uh, bookmaking and so on. It was used for a variety of things, but generally it wasn't really mass used for bookmaking. There were books made, but it wasn't used for that because it was hard to make. So what Muslims acquired the idea of paper making, but they made the process, they streamlined it better, they made it industrial, and they made the paper better, so that the quality was actually much better, and then they could mass produce books and paper making materials, which revolutionized the ability to record information and to actually produce books. So that was something that actually Muslims improved and developed to the point that it gave the West, you could say, the modern paper making materials. That created a real revolution in the West, whereas paper making didn't create a intellectual revolution in China because of it was a traditional process which was not made on to industrial levels. What the idea of, you could say, the precursors to industry before the steam engine can be seen in the Muslim world. For example, metal working. So metalworking is very hard process. Usually, you'd get a metalsmith to labor at a forge. Usually, every town or village might have a metalsmith that would basically, it would take time for them to produce swords or implements or things like this. It was very expensive. It took time to actually make these things. And the quality was varied because everyone has their own style, technique, and also depending on the wood they have available, is it damp, is it not? They couldn't get to consistency and quality. So Muslims developed, in essence, industrial metal making without using steam, and the best you could get before using steam. So Damascus had famous metalworking forges, big, massive chimneys, which would actually create a uniform and consistent or very limited variability temperature. So there's rather consistent temperatures, which would allow them to, and massive forges, which would allow them to produce a lot of implements in one day. So they could basically turn around the production of swords or the production of plowshares or what have you by the thousands in a month in one massive forge. It was as fast as you could do without having steam, basically. And not only it was produced en mass, but the quality was very high quality. So you might have heard of Damascus steel. It's actually still discussed today. Damascus steel, right, is a phrase for high quality steel, and it usually has those kind of you might see the patterns in the metal is because it's showing it's how it's folded multiple times. You don't get that level of quality outside of the Muslim world or Japan. So Japan developed that, but not industrial levels of it. Rather, it was more that the worksmiths, so it's those who are basically metalsmiths who are making the sword, would fold it a certain number of times, and the metal was more scarce in Japan, so you had to make sure that your sword didn't break in battle. So you had to make sure your sword was very high quality. So they developed it, but again, that was a laborious process, usually made by a master craftsman. But Damascus produced it en masse, thousands and thousands of them every month. They could produce it because they got the process uh, industrialized as best you could without needing to invent a steam engine. You had one thing that you also saw in the ancient world was if it's good to grow wheat. Wheat is very good. It makes bread. You can use it to make bread. So it's used for a variety of dishes, so cereals basically. But there's one problem with cereals, which is the very laborious process of you need to grind it into flour. It doesn't grind itself into flour. It must be a very fine powder in order for you to be able to use it. So you need to get two grindstones and you need to pour the flour in, right, like a little hole in the middle, and it comes out and it's ground. It's ground as these two wooden stones turn over each other. But there's a problem, which is who's going to do the turning? Right? How are you going to turn those grindstones? So the best that could be done in the ancient world was you get a donkey, poor donkey. You wouldn't use a horse because you could use a horse, but horses are useful for many things, including running fast. So what you need is a beast of burden that's more sturdy. And so a donkey, or a mix between a horse and a donkey, which is called an ass. That's where the term comes from. It's not a swear word. It's actually a description of a crossbreed. So you'd get that the donkey would be used to pull a crank, and the crank would be turning around the millstone, and it would take some time, and it would basically you'd have to feed the donkey, and of course, and maintain it, and so on, and it could only do so much work in a day before it gets tired and so on. So what the Muslims developed was the first windmill, but they used a vertical windmill. So it was basically going upwards, and it was, in essence, any direction the wind comes from, it would be able to turn the windmill and turn the grindstone. They then developed the water wheel to use rivers to do this. So what you might call green energy was developed by the early Muslims. And that they brought that into Europe when they conquered into Europe, and that was spread. So then agriculture became much more efficient, and the ability to transform wheat into flour without using beasts of burden, without just using natural energy, basically that's abundant wind and water, was a major revolution in agriculture. Also, agricultural developments. For example, many farmers would see that if they plant a crop in a piece of land for some time, eventually it will produce a poor yield, and the ground gets tired, and so they'd have to basically let it recuperate before planting again, which would basically cost valuable production time. So Muslims studied this and realized that if you just planted a different plant, some plants actually regenerate, you could say, the soil. Now, they didn't know that it was about minerals and how that works, the chemical processes that we know from modern chemistry, but they saw that it was some kind of rejuvenation of the ground, so that you actually plant different plants and different types of legumes or what have you would actually regenerate the earth. So the idea of it's called crop rotation. So you could have constant yields going, but just varying the plants, varying the legumes, varying the vegetables, varying the fruits. But you could actually maximize your output. Of course, maximize output of food means less people starving, means population growth, means that people actually have nutrition, right? And also it means that people actually have less disease. So there's less susceptibility to disease. Because the more nourished you are, obviously, the less you're going to be sick. And then, of course, the idea that you can treat diseases by adapting your diet was something that Muslims developed. now Muslims didn't invent that idea. You could see it in ancient China and things. The idea that diet can actually affect your well-being, your composition to an effect if you're struck with a disease, the healing process or your recovery or chance of recovery. So there was some basic understanding of this, obviously, you could say in ancient China. So Muslims simply developed that and took that forward, which you might today see when you in the field of being a dietitian. Right? So you might see your dietitian. Dietitian will tell you, will ask you about your health and the problems you have, and will give you diet plans to actually treat those things without needing medication. And that's basically something that Muslims actually helped develop. There's many more things. I mean, as I said, there is quite a lot. But there's a we can look at some fun things if you like. For those people who like military technology and things. So one of the things I saw was quite interesting was in Spain and Portugal. If you look at the castles that the Muslims built in Spain and Portugal. So Spain and Portugal, you could say, was generally during the Muslim times was peaceful in the Muslim areas for the most part, but there was constant fighting with a expansionist, kind of crusader mindset for northern Christians. So Muslims kind of had to develop castle technology and fortification technology in order to protect their cities and protect their people. And so they developed many ingenious devices in castles that you wouldn't see until later on in Europe. So 14th century, 15th century, 13th, 14th, and 15th century, whereas Muslims actually had developed this in 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. Those things people don't usually look at because obviously castle technology, obviously, and fortification technology, although some of the principles can be used today in fortifications, but people don't tend to look into that. So things like the L gate, L entrance. So you've seen these medieval movies where people getting a battering ram and they're battering down a door of a gate to a city or a castle. Well, Muslims simply developed the kind of the L bent entrance, which is basically you go through a door and you're faced with a wall, and you have to go around that wall, and the doorway is basically in a smaller antechamber. You have to go in, turn right, go in, and then turn left, right? And there's no space to actually then take a battering ram to batter down the door because it's a bent entrance, right? So it's a bent entrance. So that was something that Muslim developed, as well as various kinds. For example, a tower that sticks out, that comes out of the wall. So there's, you might see there's a castle, and then there's a tower that is actually outside the castle, but connected on the top to the castle walls. And people think, why is that? Well, when you're attacking a castle wall and you're trying to obviously conquer it, you're facing forwards, right? You're facing the wall, and you're trying to protect yourself with a shield from people shooting you from the front. But if there's a tower that's sticking out to the side, it can the archers on there could shoot you on the side, right? They could shoot you there, and you actually can't attack forward because you're being shot from the side. So these were things that Muslims developed, defensive technologies that Muslims developed. And to the point that most Muslim cities in Iberia, in Spain and Portugal, most Muslim castles and cities were never actually conquered through storming. So they were never actually stormed by the Spanish Crusaders because they were impregnable. But what usually happened is that the Spanish Crusaders would surround the city and would manage to wait 2-3 years until the populations began to starve. And then they would surrender voluntarily and come to terms and say, okay, just let us leave and don't kill us, and you can take the town. And that's usually how cities in Islamic Spain and Portugal were conquered, was by, in essence, starvation, but not by conquest, because the idea was to protect the people, to protect, obviously, making defensive technologies. But there are other things that actually Muslims, funnily enough, invented. Was the Eastern Roman Empire developed, flamethrowers basic flamethrowers, and Muslims took that idea and made actual flamethrowers that were a bit more powerful, such that the Crusaders, when they actually fought the Muslims, saw that Muslims used fire-based weapons, which terrified them, including things like grenades that actually exploded and fragmented when thrown, because they were lit with this very powerful substances. This is prior to gunpowder. But you also see that in European accounts, the first mention of gunpowder weapons in using tubes. So in the conquest of south of Spain, so when the Crusaders had to have pushed all the way to South Spain, you see the first records of them encountering Muslims on the battlements, on the walls, having a tube that makes some kind of explosion or spark and smoke, shooting a projectile. And they didn't have a name for it at that point in time. It was like, what's going on? This is some. They heard it was just it was a rumor at some points. It was mentioned in some accounts, like, what's going on? We're hearing this thing about, what is this tube device that explodes at one end and shoots a projectile out. So this is the very first mentions of gunpowder, gunpowder weapons in the gun technology, you might say. Now, China developed gunpowder first, but they never developed the idea of using gunpowder in a metal tube to contain an explosion, and then exploiting that explosion, so harnessing that explosion to accelerate and propel a projectile. So they didn't actually develop that idea. You might say the best they was maybe rocket, or a type of rocket technology. But even rocket technology, here's a funny thing. So rockets are based on, rockets are used to propel satellites and go to the moon and send astronauts to space to go on space stations and make space stations even possible. So rockets are something which are viewed obviously as a very modern invention. But did you know that actually the rocket, especially with a stabilizer, so stabilized spin, was actually a Muslim invention? And we actually see it get the British Army, when conquering India, are actually encounters the rocket technology on the battlefield used by the armies that they encountered. But it wasn't as you'd expect. So it wasn't a rocket that would be fired and explode, but rather it would be a rocket that would have a kind of a sword or a blade that was coming out the back. So then the rocket would be shot up into the air against the enemy army, against the British, basically. And what they saw, the rocket came up in the air, and then it would lose its propellant. It would burn out its propellant, and then it would begin to spin. And as it spins, then it starts to come back down to earth, a spinning blade, hitting the British army, so hitting the British soldiers and so on. So they saw this, and they said, that's a very good idea. This idea. So let's look at it. Let's take the idea of these rockets, and then they took the idea of these rockets and developed it into a military purpose. And then from a military purpose, the idea of rocket artillery, which was used in the Napoleonic Wars as an experimental artillery, but the idea of rocket artillery, which was used by the British to the point that it's in the American national anthem, right? The rocket's red glare, right? And bombs bursting in air, right? That was the British artillery, rocket artillery, that they learned from Muslims in India, basically. So it still has, you could say it's the mentions of these things which were learned from Muslims are actually still present around us. So there's quite a lot of things, from chemistry to medicine to the study of the natural world, physics, astronomy, even ideas of gravity. Although there was no Muslims didn't come up with the concept of a force, but they are called gravity. But there was a study which proposed the idea that there was something which is pulling people to the center of the earth, but that was it. They didn't go further into what that was. That was taken forward by Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton who many have said was a notorious plagiarizer. So he actually would take works of other people. Certainly Leibniz would say that, one of his a rival. But he had access to and knowledge of Arabic texts which were translated, which contained like Ibn Haytham's ideas on optics. And of course, Isaac Newton is famous. One of the things he's famous for is his work on optics as well, which curiously resembles the works of Ibn Haytham. And optics is obviously very vital. I mean, the reason why we're communicating right now, and you can see me, is optics. And I don't mean just the camera. I mean that the signals you're not, unless you're using old copper wire dial-up modem, you're using, of course, fiber optic, which obviously is basically lasers being shot via a medium, which get to you. So in essence, we're communicating by light, by optics. So this is some of the things that Muslims developed, and again, I could go into many more things which they kind of discovered, which reached the West. But I would bring a few quotations here to, I suppose, just show what historians of science have noticed when looking at Islamic civilization. So Fred Wilson, who's a professor emeritus of science, teaching and society at the Rochester Institute of Technology, noted in his work, History of Science, Islam, he said, in contrast to Chinese and Hindu science, Islamic science came to exert an immense influence on the West, partly because of geographical proximity of the two cultures, and partly because both cultures shared a common Greek heritage. But Islamic science and philosophy emerged in large part in response to the Islamic theological assumption that nature contains signs, and the unearthing of such signs would bring the believer closer to God. Adam Smith, the famous economist, 18th century, some people might say the founding father of modern capitalism, he said, the ruin of the empire of the Romans, and along with it, the subversion of all law and order, which happened a few centuries afterwards, produced the entire neglect of that study of the connecting principles of nature. The empire of the caliphs seems to have been the first day under which the world enjoyed that degree of tranquility which the cultivation of the sciences requires. It was under the protection of those generous and magnificent princes that tranquility which their mild, just, and religious government diffused over their vast empire revived the curiosity of mankind to inquire into the connecting principles of nature. Also, Montgomery Watt, Professor Emeritus of the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Edinburgh, said, for our cultural indebtedness to Islam, we Europeans have a blind spot. We sometimes belittle the extent and importance of Islamic influence in our heritage, and sometimes overlook it altogether. To try to cover it over and deny it is a mark of false pride. And there's also Robert Briffaut in his book, The Making of Humanity. He argues that the existence of modern science is based in the scientific thought and knowledge that emerged in Islamic civilizations during the time of Al-Hazan, which is the Latinized version of the word Ibn Haytham. So Al-Hazan, again, he became a famous scientist known to the Europeans during the Renaissance. Now, what happened in the West? Right? So what happened to kickstart the study of the natural world and to develop technology? Well, it was a change of perspective, and in a sense, the modern West actually is a result of Islam in more ways than you think. So up until about the 11th century, so the 11th century to 12th centuries, there was the dominant idea amongst Christians in the West. So you had these barbaric Germans who converted to Christianity, and they conquered Spain, they conquered France, they conquered England, Anglo-Saxons, they conquered Italy, Uh, they spread throughout, and even at some point North Africa to some extent. So they spread throughout. So the Lombards were the Germans who conquered the Italians, and they didn't know what to do with Roman technology. They didn't repair it. It went to waste. And I mean, they didn't do it nothing, but they create kingdoms and these kingdoms formed the modern Europe that we see today. But they didn't really do anything else. There was no expansion or ideas or development of technology. And the Christian concept up to this point in time was that, as the Bible says, the New Testament, not the teaching of, you might not disputably not what Jesus said, but this is a different discussion. But what's in the New Testament, which is not always the writings of Jesus, by the way. Most of it actually is writings of Paul. Paul's writings, his letters, and things like this, which it is not really a controversial factor. If you look at the Bible, there's no chapter that says, this is according to Jesus. The chapter according to Jesus, letters according to Jesus. So obviously, it's Paul's letters to the Ephesians, Paul's letters to the Romans, the Galatians, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's a different discussion. So in the New Testament, it says that the devil is the prince of this world. So the devil is the prince, meaning the ruler. So the devil is the ruler of this world. He rules this world. This world is evil. It is incorrigible. It is corrupted. The only thing that you can do is to basically protect yourself from this corruption by believing in Jesus, being changed by the Holy Spirit, making yourself a righteous person, and then your soul is saved. And your goal as a Christian is to save as many souls from this evil world until Jesus' second coming, until Jesus comes, and then he will change the world into a righteous and correct world. The world will be redeemed and saved. But before that point in time, the world is irredeemable, it's unsavable. Best not to do anything, right? Just wait for the Mahdi and don't do. Sorry. Just wait for Jesus' second coming. So, where have I heard that idea before? Anyway, just wait for his second coming, and because there's no point of trying to change something that's not changeable. That was the Christian mindset. It was about salvation. It wasn't about being worldly. It didn't mean that they wouldn't give charity or help the poor. It was just simply that you couldn't improve the world. Only Jesus can improve the world, and that can only come when he comes back. So it was no point then studying the natural world or trying to improve technology or medicine, what have you, because the world is evil. It's a bad place of suffering. Where your energies are best focused is in salvation of souls. That's where your energies are best focused. So when they encountered Muslim civilization, who they considered to be infidels, they were quite shocked by what they saw. There were many monks that traveled in the Muslim world and were shocked by how trustworthy and honest Muslims were compared to Christians. Hugo Grotius, who is credited as the founder of international law, often noted that Christians need to be ruled by a law that refrains them from war crimes during when they fight each other, because they said not even the infidels, when they fight each other, go all out and commit the kind of crimes you see happen in the West. So there was they noticed that these infidels, non-Christians, were better behaved, more civilized, and their society was more advanced, technologically speaking, was more at ease. They were less susceptible to diseases compared to Western cities. They were less susceptible to famine and starvation, and so on. The church was had obviously almshouses. It would give charity, but it wouldn't deal with root causes of famine problems like this. So they were shocked. This was a shock to the system that, wait, these infidels had actually improved their society in an unimprovable world. It caused a very foundational shock to the point that they reassessed their assumptions. And then an idea was born, the idea of progress, that actually you can have material progress in this world, and it's not incompatible with being a Christian, because yes, Jesus will come and save everybody and save the world and everything will be great, but you shouldn't surrender the whole world to the devil. You can have some victories against the devil, right? It is possible, because look at these infidels. So you can have some improvement. That was a shocking idea of the West, and it created the Renaissance, the rebirth. It's called Renaissance. It was a rebirth of the West, where they said, oh, yeah, actually, we can make improvements to our society. We can improve people's lives. And they took all the textbooks they could find from the Muslims concerning technology, science, mathematics. They took none of our books on ethics, none of our books on creed, because for them, they said, well, we don't need this. We only need your maths, your astronomy, your agriculture, your biology books, your chemistry books. We want your medicine books, your instruments, your technology. We want that. We don't want this other stuff that's not relevant to us. We don't, and it's heretical to us anyway. So that's what happened. And then, of course, the idea of progress became a force in the West, to the point that, progress is a value in the West that's independent of religion. It's a, where did it come from, right? When again, it never occurred to Westerners for centuries and centuries, after at least 600 years since the Roman Empire fell, when these Germanic barbarians came, it didn't occur to them. But then when they encountered Muslims, it began to occur the idea of progress. But there's also something else that also happened as well, which was the Catholic Church was the remnant of the Roman Empire, and they preserved a few texts, but they had people, their clerics were specialized in reading and writing Latin, but from these clerics and these institutions where they would be, monasteries, they would create universities for the teaching of theology, and then eventually the teaching of Roman law and Germanic law and codifications of these laws. As the states became more sophisticated, and then the kings could then draw upon this pool of intellectuals, you could say, scholastics to draw upon. But what created the Roman Church? Because the Roman Church didn't directly rule the Europeans, but by the way, contrary to what you might believe, they were like an semi-independent, autonomous institution that gave authentication or validity to the kings, and in return, the kings don't touch church property and might have to give contributions and things to the king. So, what created the church in the first place? What most people don't realize is that what this Roman Catholic Church, which is the basis for the West, by the way, because the Eastern Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians, are not Westerners, right? Russians are not Westerners, right? So why is they're Christian though? So why is it this East-West divide? It's because the Westerners are the peoples of the former Catholic, if they became Protestants anyway, obviously, but they were still from a Catholic origin. So it was the Catholic Church, the Latin-speaking part of Europe, and the Catholic Church create a kind of a well, not a really effective one, but a type of, you could say, a proto UN, but dominated by the Pope, who would tell Christian kings to stop fighting each other, and to fight the infidels instead. But generally speaking, it gave some kind of common medium, a common forum between the Western kings. But what did you know? The Catholic Church, in a sense, or in a very real sense, was actually created by, unwittingly, of course, the Muslims, which most people don't realize. So before the Catholic Church existed, there was a council of bishops, right? And each bishop was given control of a different city or area. So the Bishop of Rome, the Bishop of Antioch, the Bishop of Constantinople, Bishop of Alexandria, and so on. It was a pentarchy of these 5 bishops. These 5 bishops were under control of the Roman emperor. And when the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern Roman emperor became the controller of these bishops, basically. So these bishops would only do what the would only do what the emperor lets them do, and the emperor controls these bishops, controls what they say, their doctrines, and what have you. So that the Roman Empire, which converted to Christianity, defined Christianity, controlled it, kept it captive, you could say. But then something happened, which is the Eastern Roman Empire actually controlled Rome, part of Italy, and actually even tried to reconquer and try to reestablish the full Roman Empire later on. It wasn't fully successful. It was expanding up until the time Islam came on the scene. And then when Islam came on the scene, Islam basically expanded in both in direction of the Persian Empire and the Romans. And this expansion, taking over Roman territories, Syria, Egypt, and the rest of North Africa, weakened the Romans critically to the point that they had to eventually retreat from direct control of Rome. And once they retreated from direct control of Rome, the Bishop of Rome basically asserted his freedom. So, you know what? I don't need you guys anymore, and you can't control me. Instead, I'm going to look for other allies amongst these Germanic pagans who are now Christian. I'm going to look for them, and I'm going to make them a deal, which is I'll give them legitimacy. I'll give their kings legitimacy, and in return, they will patronize, my institution. So the Bishop of Rome was released from captivity, you could say, by the receding of the Roman Empire from controlling Rome because of the Muslims attacking the Roman Empire, basically. So, in a sense, the Roman Catholic Church, as this separate institution, this last remnant of Roman administration, law, literature, was because the Muslims weakened its captors and allowed it to, in essence, kind of split free. So then, okay, that's what happened to the West, and then the rest is history, as they say. But what happened to the Muslims? What happened to the Muslim civilization? And I'll reach the end of my lecture here, and then we open up for Q&A. So what happened to the Muslims was the worst thing that could happen to any civilization: success. The Muslim civilization reached a civilizational plateau of success. Very sophisticated and complex agricultural systems, economy. It was controlling the trade routes of the world, so it would charge for spices. And it rested on its laurels, as they say. It grew comfortable, and then you see a second thing happened, which is it began to then just enjoy the luxuries, luxurious lives, and whatnot. The luxury kills a civilization, and because necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. So luxury and success kills a civilization, and what that led to was, in essence, Muslims seeking to actually improve or push the boundaries of knowledge, and rather just simply enjoying what they had because they were so rich. And what you see many European chroniclers who go into the Muslim world around about 16, 17, 1800s, they all say the same things: decadent, right? Lethargic and decadent. Right? Decadent is not what the word you hear today. You might hear austere. They don't. They're not into partying and what have you, but say they're very austere. But back then it was decadent, licentious, and many of these paintings show very elaborately, wonderfully dressed people, very beautiful robes and things. But the buildings in the background are poorly maintained. Sort of like the infrastructure is beginning to crumble, and yet everyone's focused on just as long as they look that they are rich or comfortable, or and they look wealthy and so on. That's the most important. They are enjoying their luxuries. So that was, in essence, a big mind killer of the Muslim world, was luxury and success. And that tends to happen to many civilizations. Ibn Khaldun, again, grandfather of sociology, or the father of sociology, um, predicted there'd be a cyclical, a cyclical rise and fall of civilizations due to luxury. Luxury kills civilizations. But there was also something else, which is Europe discovered, because they wanted to go around the Muslim world, because they wanted to not pay uh, rate tariffs. All right. Funnily enough, for those of you obviously under the shadow or threat of Trump, right, as Canadians, um, having a very noisy neighbor. To get around the tariffs that Muslims would charge simply from being in the center of the trade routes, and then so basically spices and things gets to the west, they have to pay tariffs for it to travel via Western trade, via Muslim trade routes, in the center of the world, in essence. They wanted to go around it, direct access, cut out the middleman, and so they bumped into something they weren't expecting, trying to reach the East Indies. They bumped into the West Indies. Well, not really the Indies at all, but that's what they call it. They discovered the quote unquote New World, and with it, lots and lots of riches, resources, and land to expand upon. And this then accelerated Western development, and gave West a lot of wealth, to the point that they could go to the Muslim world, and in essence, you see actually they would come with lots of wealth and actually buy up Muslim resources, because they actually have more gold, more silver, because they actually mine this stuff using a lot of slaves in the New World. And so then we have people that have obviously greater purchasing parity, so larger or superior purchasing parity than yourself, then this affects your economy. But then gradually, as industrialization occurred in the West, they could then produce goods at a cheaper rate, high quality goods at a cheaper rate than you could make them locally in Muslim lands. Sounds familiar, right? And it kills your manufacturing sector. And so what you see, for many historians, I've actually see that there's a decline of manufacturing happens in the Muslim world, and it turns more into a service sector. So service sector increases and manufacturing sector decreases. So all this begins to happen in the Muslim world. And then added to that, Muslims begin to face the first military defeats, like the conquest of India, like Napoleon Bonaparte conquers Egypt. And this is a big shock, because at that point in time, especially under the Ottomans had 300 years of military successes. And of course, the Muslims had pushed out the Crusaders. They had pushed back, and they were unassailable. Many crusading leagues had almost all the crusades, apart from the first crusade, all crusades failed afterwards. And they never thought they could be militarily beaten, but now they were beaten with ease. And this was a big shock to the system. And this created a change in the Muslim mindset that we have today. Defeatism, that you can't actually win against anyone, any major power in the world. So there's no point trying anymore. Fatalism, the idea that, well, this is the end times, or that we have to wait for the Mahdi to come, and only he will improve the world and make save it and redeem it. But everything you do is futile up until then. Doesn't that parallel the Christian mindset until 11th century? Right, exactly. And so almost like the West and the Muslim world switched places in terms of mindset. Right. Now, many people might say, well, surely, does Islam actually even command Muslims to improve or develop, or to study or learn in the first place? Like, is it just maybe maybe it was a quirk of history that Muslim civilization just felt like that? But it's not actually, it wasn't their holy book teaching them these things, or the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad teaching them these things. And this is where you'd be very wrong. More than even in the Bible, because some Christians try to say, especially American Christian nationalists, they have a kind of revisionist view of history. So, the West is superior and dominant because of Christianity. Christianity made it this way. It was Christian values made it this way. They might say Judeo-Christian values, but that's only a recent thing because of Israel and Zionism and the connection between U.S. politicians and others and their alliance of convenience with Zionists to control the Middle East. Separate discussion, of course, because I say this because 100 and so years ago, the Christians back then hated Jews and would say, no, it's only Christian values. We are a Christian civilization. The idea of saying Judea was an insult to them. To add that on, that only came later. Anyway, that's a different discussion. So we know that they were anti-Semitic back then. So obviously, then somehow Christians just changed their minds, which is a different discussion. So we see in the Quran there are many verses that directly command curiosity of the Muslim. So we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, would not they go and see how camels are created, how the sky is raised high, how the mountains fixed firm, how the earth is spread out? Another verse, do you see the water which you drink? Do you bring it down from the cloud, or do we? Verily and another verse, verily in the heavens and the earth are signs for those who believe. Another verse, now let man consider how he came into earthly existence. He is created from a gushing fluid proceeding from between the backbone and the ribs. And another verse, verily in the creation of the heavens and the earth and in the alternation of night and day, these are indeed signs for men of understanding. So we see these verses talk about, and again, there's many more. Do not disbelieve, see that the heavens and the earth are one unit, then Allah, expanded it or rent it asunder, split it apart. It commands you to observe, see, and these are signs, right? The Muslims believe in two holy books. We believe in the Quran, and which is called the ayat of Allah, which has ayat in Arabic means to be in a verse. The verses of the Quran are ayats. But the word for the signs in the universe is the same word, right? Ayat or ayat. So the verses in the Quran and the signs of the universe have the same word. These are all the ayat of Allah. So Allah's signs. So we have two holy books, the natural world, the universe, and the Quran. And as Muslims, we're commanded to study both of these holy books. We also see, again, in the Quran, Allah has indeed made all things in heaven and the earth subservient to humankind. It is all from Him. Here verily are signs for people who reflect. So we see another verse, and seek by means of what Allah has given you the future abode, and do not neglect your portion of this world. So don't say, I'm only thinking of the hereafter. No, you need to also, you can't neglect your earthly life, it's the earthly world. Another narration, there's a narration by the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A Muslim is never satisfied in his quest for good till it ends in paradise. And another verse of the Quran, to add to the other verses, then disperse in the land and seek Allah's bounty. So seek the things that Allah has given for us. So disperse, go out and look and see Allah, but explore and see the riches and see the things that has been given to you. So the universe can be subjected to us. The universe can be subjected to human beings for our usage. We can use this universe. We are commanded to go and see the bounties that are in this universe, and we are commanded to see that everything is actually a sign from God. So everything has knowledge, has a reason for it, has a purpose behind it, but is also understandable and also reflects God's nature. You can learn more about God from studying what He has created. Like you can learn about an artist, their mindset, their mentality, by seeing their work, their pictures, their paintings, their music, their sculpture, tells you about the artist. So for us, studying the natural world is a spiritual experience. It's theology, right? It is studying the mind of God, so to speak. What about practical issues, right? Practical matters. We see the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam talks about improving the living conditions, the charity. He says removing something harmful from the road is like giving charity. It's which is, and of course, as Muslims, we're commanded to give charity to the poor and to help alleviate people's suffering. But even just making the road conditions better is a charity. We see in the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad said, whoever fulfills the needs of his brother, God will fulfill his needs. So if you fulfill other people's needs, your needs will be fulfilled. There's another narration. A Bedouin went to the Prophet of God and said, "Oh, Messenger of Allah, should we not treat sickness?" He said, "Treat sickness, for Allah has not created any disease, except He has also created the cure." So there's the idea that every disease has a cure, that there is a cure. You might not know it. So then treat it and seek that cure. That was a great motivation for the medical sciences amongst the Muslims. There's also things like in the Quran it says, and in terms of obviously Muslims should be prepared to defend the weak, the oppressed. So the Quran says, "What is wrong with you that you fight not for the weak and oppressed amongst men, women, and children?" Which it doesn't say the weak and oppressed amongst Muslims. It says the weak and oppressed amongst men, women, and children. That's all of humanity. So we have to fight for everyone who's oppressed. And to do so, we have to make sure we're militarily strong to fight for anyone who's oppressed amongst men, women, and children. It's in the Quran. It's none of us Quran. It says, against them, make ready your strength to the utmost of your power, including steeds of war, to strike fear into the hearts of the enemies of God and your enemies and others besides whom you may not know. So we see that the Quran is telling you that telling Muslims that we have to actually make sure that our military abilities. So it says, prepare your strength, ready your strength, not just get numbers of people. No, prepare your strength, and give an example like your steeds of war, your war horses, for example, so that to strike fear into the enemies of God, your enemies, and others besides whom you may not know, so that we can achieve the protection of the weak and oppressed amongst men, women, and children throughout the globe, whoever they are, may be Muslim or non-Muslim. So this is the encouragement to develop military technology, encouragement to develop medicine, encouraged to improve the conditions of people. There are other many narrations, and I mean many narrations, which talk about making sure that people have access to food, clothing, shelter, energy source, education. But also we see in the Quran, for example, and horses, mules, and donkeys, both to ride for adornment, and He creates other things you know not. So we see in the Quran, it talks about the means of transportation that was available to the Arabs when the Quran came down, which was horses, mules, and donkeys were created for ride and for adornment. So they obviously, they're still things are viewed as beautiful things to ride and beautiful things to possess. But also says, and other things, so other methods of transportation, you could say, that you don't know yet. So what are they? Go and seek them out. What other things has He created for you of transportation? And that doesn't mean pre-existing transportation things, but because God is both God of time and space, so He creates the future as much as He creates the past and the things. So we would say God created the cars, even though humans invented the idea of the car, because God created all the things in this universe and the conditions for you to invent, allow cars to be possible. And He would know cars would be possible, and He intended cars to come into existence. So we'd say God created cars, even though we'd say yes, but humans invented it. So there's many things, and I said this lecture could be 10 times larger if I wanted to list all the inventions and technology and achievements that Muslims have actually achieved. But what I want to say, my final message really, is Muslims should not be living in the past. Right? This is mutakhallif, backwardness. The Prophet Muhammad and the companions of the Prophet Muhammad always thought about the future. Everything that happened in the past is, yes, fine, Muslims achieved this stuff, great. So what? It means nothing now. I mean, sure, maybe in academic debates with bigots who say, what has Islam ever done for us? It might be good to know these things just to make an argument in a debate, but it has no practical consequence. And of course, there's many narrations and quotes by Islamic scholars that have said that knowledge that has no benefit is useless. So for us, it's okay. This is great to know for just knowledge and to know how know what happened in the past. But its primary purpose is to really teach you what is possible. Muslims need to rediscover the mindset and mentality which the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad taught that led Muslims to want to improve society, improve people. Why? For the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to gain his pleasure, to please him, to do something for the Creator. It was for his sake that we did all these good deeds and to help people, to be charitable, to alleviate. Because if we alleviate someone's suffering, God will alleviate our suffering in this life and the next. And of course, we worry about how we're going to be judged by God. And many of these inventors wanted to get what's called a sadaqah jariyah, right? A ongoing reward. So basically, in Islam, your good deeds end when you die. So you can't do any more good deeds, except some cases, a few cases. And one of these cases is that you've left behind something that continued to do good. That could be knowledge. That could be you dug a well for someone and it still supplies a village with water, as an example. You build a hospital, and that hospital serves people. You build a waqf institution, a trust institution that serves the poor, or what have you, serves the public. Anything you leave behind multiplies your good deeds for everyone that benefits from it. And of course, the one that multiplies the most is knowledge. And so that motivated Muslims to gain knowledge. They said we want to know knowledge that we can then teach, and so millions of people can be benefited, that will all go into my account in front of God, that God would put on to make my scales heavy on the day of judgment of good deeds, that I can attain salvation. So anyway, that was one of the most driving forces of Islamic civilization, is that making deeds which could multiply even after you passed away, leaving a legacy behind that multiplies and benefits humanity, because everyone that benefits from it credits your account, you could say, on the day of judgment in front of the creator universe. And if we rediscover this and discover that it's actually part of spirituality to get to know God by his creation, it's part of spirituality to study the mind of God, so to speak, via the natural world, as much as we read it in the Quran. And in fact, we need both. If that was rediscovered, you'd see a change in Islamic civilization. And as the Quran says, God does not change the situation of a people until they change what is within themselves. What is within yourselves? It's your mindset. So once you change your mindset, then your conditions change. Okay. Barakallahu feekum. I will leave it there in terms of the lecture. I'll open up for Q&A.
All right, assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Ustaz, for the amazing lecture. We have a few questions that came in through the sign up form. So I'll go through those first, and then I'll open the floor for those in the meeting. So the first question, and you touched a bit on that, it says, can you speak about how Muslims inspired by Islam cultivated the land and took care of nature in the past that allowed it to prosper, and how to use that knowledge today?
So Sorry, say that again. Sorry, my main camera failed, so I've had to switch cameras. How they cultivated the land. I think I gave an example during the lecture of that.
Yes.
But there's other examples, such as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught, for example, that so the let's say the tax on land is that's 10%, which is given as tax to the state, so this for the state's coffers in order for the state treasury to then discharge its duties, including helping people and the poor and so on. But if someone artificially irrigates their land, they don't just rely on the rain or whatever, but they artificially irrigate their land, then the tax is reduced by half. This is what the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught. Why? Well, the wisdom we can see is it actually is an incentive for people to basically improve their irrigation of their own territory because they get tax break from improving the irrigation. But if you improve your irrigation, you also maximize your yield increases. So it's tax breaks to increase your yield. And this is the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we can clearly see that there is an emphasis on maximization of the land usage. Also, if someone has land and they don't use it for agriculture, and it's arable land, after 3 years, it is removed from them and given to anyone that will use it and will use it for agriculture. So it's about not wasting land, or if you're like a rich individual and you have a large area of land and you don't use it for agriculture, you just want to enjoy it as your personal park, even though that land is suitable for agriculture, then it can be removed from you and given to poor people who are willing to work that land and actually generate food from that land that will feed themselves and with the excess obviously feed wider society. So those are just some examples of how Islam encourages maximization of the resources to hand in order to alleviate poverty and also to prevent unfair monopolies of land that's not being used by rich landowners. Okay. What other questions are there?
Second question, how can we share our values with Western culture while staying true to the principles of our religion?
Share your values of Western culture in what sense? Like share
Honestly,
meaning I tell we explain it our values, and we invite them to Islam, which obviously you should be sharing your values with the West. Or are you saying that we have to adopt Western values because that we are in the West? And how do we do that without losing our Islam? Is that the question?
It just says, how can we share our values with Western culture? So I assume the first one.
Well, the first one is inviting people to Islam, which is you don't lose your doesn't endanger Islam by inviting people to it. So I'm going to assume it's the second one because the first one wouldn't make sense. So the second one is how do we share values with the West? I mean, okay, firstly, the West is just a geographic name for the civilization that was based upon the Roman Catholic Church since the 15th century. But what I would argue is we should not copy, we should do to the West what they did to us, exactly what they did to us in terms of in the Renaissance, just prior to the Renaissance. They took all our maths, technology, sciences, chemistry, astronomy, and they didn't take anything of our books on ethics, justice, theology. Now, there was some individuals that they, like Ibn Rushd, which they, and Ibn Sina and others, they took some of their philosophies, their commentary on Aristotle, and but of course the church declared that heretical, like don't listen to these Muslims, these infidels. Then there's nothing they have for us of any use in terms of their ideas of morals, ethics, theology. We have the Bible for this. We just want their their tech. We just want their scientific knowledge, nothing else. So we should, in essence, then, I suppose, do exactly the same thing, which is that the West's ideas of justice, ethics, worldview, epistemologies are based on speculations peculiar and that arose historically from the discourses in their civilization and have no basis for us. The Quran and the Sunnah, which is basically revealed by the creator of the universe, defines for us what is our good and bad, our should and should not. So, in essence, if I want to distill it for you, learn about what is and is not from natural sciences, from anyone that studies natural sciences, any civilization. But do not take what knowledge, not so-called knowledge about what you should and should not do from anyone except from the Quran and Sunnah. That includes ideas of justice, the idea of social justice, the idea of ethics and virtue. We should not take from anyone, even if they might use similar words. Like, of course, everyone uses similar words, righteousness, or everyone has the word of being just and upright. We use these terms. Everyone has similar terms, but they mean something different by these terms. So do not take it from the West at all. But it doesn't hurt to study it as an objective fact of the West's ideas. So, like, this is what the West believes. It's good to know it because you have to speak, you have to engage with them. So it's good to know what they believe in. It's very important to know. When I say they, I mean, because we were born in the West, most of us, so technically we're all Western, but I mean the Enlightenment ideas, they call it, which was the birth of materialist political philosophies and ethical philosophies in the West. So I'm going to be more specific. The Enlightenment ideas, it's good to know them. I give courses on them. I teach them because I think it's useful for you to know them. But we should study them like we study Egyptology, the study of ancient Egypt. No one studies the ancient Egyptians to learn, okay, let's take their morals and ethics and values. No, it's more like we just want to know what they believed, how they saw the world, their practices, their culture. No one studies it to adopt it. It would be ridiculous. Like, why what? You study it as simply, I want to get to know this ancient civilization, what they were like. So I, in essence, pioneered the idea of Occidentology, which is study of the West objectively, not in a biased way or for a biased way. Because that we should never be biased. We have to be honest when we study anything. So an objective study of the West, go for it. It helps you when you engage their ideas, but never adopt their values, ethics, and so on. If we happen to agree on, like, let's say some Western law systems believe that murder is wrong. The Sharia believes murder is wrong. They believe that theft is wrong. We believe theft is wrong. Doesn't mean we're the same, right? We might have come to the same conclusions on a number of points, so to speak, but the epistemological basis for these ethics and values, the origins of these, are different, and so we can't adopt because they might then veer us away from things in Islam. And many Muslims, for example, might become right wing or left wing. So they adopt the different schools of thought in the West, and they even fight each other on ideas which are not even from Islam. So some become conservatives, others become Marxist, neo-Marxist, socialists, or liberals, and they fight each other when they're all following false ethical and political philosophical premises. Anyway, that's in a nutshell.
All right, thank you for that answer. Now here's a bit of a longer bunch of questions. Why didn't Muslims produce as much as West in science and technology? Is it because of our ideology? I think the answer there is would be obvious. We had 8 to 10 centuries to do that, but we produced much less when compared to the West.
So repeat that first bit again. So I think it cut out a little bit.
Oh, why didn't Muslims produce as much as the West in science and technology? Is it because of our ideology?
Okay, so what people have noticed, I mean, if you look at history, technological study and progression almost becomes like on a elliptical curve. So that basically the more you study and learn, the faster you study and learn over time. So in essence, I mean, the Muslim world had about 1,000 years of technological development and advancement, which radically changed the conditions from of the early medieval world, creating the basis for what's called the modern age in the Western naming of the epochs. But as the rate of knowledge gaining that let's say Muslims achieved was at a much faster rate than ancient Egyptians and then ancient Greeks, than the Romans, for example. So that doesn't really show that the West is somehow better or Muslims their theology keeps them down, because the rate of improvement or the rate of study is somehow linked to the creed, but more it's just simply the nature of the sciences. The more tools that you discover, the more things are unlocked. You could say more new discoveries can be unlocked. So the steam engine um, allowed mass industrialization, the industrial age to come about. Advances in metallurgy allowed experiments that were not possible before to be carried out, and then multiple experiments. So the more tools you invent, the more experiments you can conduct, the more new tools you can invent, and so on. So it's almost exponentially increases. So that's just a factor of time. But if you look historically at the West, it's coming up to its 900th year since the 1100s. If I'm going to let's be generous and say 1100s is the beginning of the Renaissance for them. Where remember, they very slowly begin to change, slowly, and it gets a little bit faster. It gets faster, 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 and so on and so forth. So, but now in its 900th year, the West has a variety of problems. Like Britain is becoming bankrupt and economically declining as a power in all senses. Europe, in many countries, the same. Who are now the new civilizations on the block, which are actually expanding and in terms of their development at a much faster rate than the West. China, for example. China, they've produced more concrete in the last 30 years than the entire history of America, right? For example, for construction and building and so on. So the rate of their expansion of their economy, considering that China was a backwater, only what? Let's be conservative here. So it was a backwater, maybe approximately 100 years ago, maybe the 40s, still a bit of a backwater. So 90 years ago. But how old is America? The United States of America, obviously. Because technically Canadians are American, North American, right? But how old is United States of America, right? It's over 200 years old, right? Probably around 240 or something years old. And China is already beginning to reach parity with the United States of America, and it's only been around for about 90 years, so half the time, less than half the time of the United States of America, right? The Soviet Union, within a short, 70 years, actually reached military parity and economic parity with USA, or to some extent, although it collapsed on the way of its own ideology. But still, it was I mean, considering that it was usually a peasant farming, economy with not as much industrialization as its Western European counterparts, and that's at the 1920s, and it went from that to being a nuclear power in the space of 30 years, to rival the United States of America, which had already been going for over 150 years of industrialization. Or more, 200 years. So does that mean that the Soviet Union was more advanced as a civilization, even though it collapsed. And when China is more advanced because of its creed or something? No, it's just the nature of it that science and technology will increase exponentially because by its very nature. But who is the torchbearer can change. Who is the torchbearer of science technology can change, but between different civilizations. So that's all it really shows. It has nothing to do with the creeds or the beliefs of the civilization itself, but rather where they come in time during the whole the global process of learning new information and inventing new things. Okay, I think I see the hand up by Omaima. Go ahead.
Sorry, there are a few more, two more questions that I'd like to ask, and I'll open the floor for the people here.
Sure. Well, can we mix up a little bit? Just one full question
Sure.
and then maybe a few written questions.
Sure.
Brother, I understood that you were from the UK. So there's something in the British Museum, like in the last 10 years or so. It was like the 1001 inventions by Muslim. Do you know what I'm talking about? So there was a book. It's a very, very big book. It's like a compendium, like an encyclopedia of 1001 inventions by Muslim civilization. And then it was taken into the museum in Britain, I think in London, if I'm not mistaken. Are you aware of this?
Yes.
Are you aware?
Also,
Are you aware of the book? Because the book was the beginning.
Yes, patroned by the National Geographic. Yes.
Yes. So then there's another book that came out. So I'm a teacher. I teach in elementary and high school. So we use the National Geographic book. There's a children's version that's really, really small, and it's all picturesque and very easy to navigate. It doesn't cover the 1001 products that Muslims invented, but the larger compendium, the larger encyclopedia, actually covers as many as. Do you know who did the research, who collected all the data? Because that goes to, for what you've described tonight, a lot of the products, whether it's coffee, whether it's like the way a fort is built, like a fort in an army situation, the way it was built by the Muslim civilization. And actually, they learned from the Byzantine and from the Greek. They learned from different groups, and then they kind of enhanced those buildings. I also noticed in some parts of Europe, especially in Germany, the way the architecture of the homes are in order to keep it warm in the warm in the winter and cool in the summer. It's built a certain way that Muslims designed up above and beyond the other designs that were there during those times. Anyway, so if you could comment on this piece of work, which is basically collecting over 1001 inventions that Muslims developed, including the astrolabe glasses, soap. Like, I didn't realize that we invented soap. I didn't realize that we invented well, we didn't invent the miswak. The miswak was part of that Arab culture, but we took the miswak around the world, and now it's being used all over the world now for Muslims and non-Muslims as a better dental hygiene product than toothbrush. So I don't know if you want to comment about that, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, like, if you want to do the research on the inventions that came from the Muslim world, there's plenty of literature and books out there available to read and so on. I mean, I would obviously carefully go through them, but with more of a skeptical eye too, because as I said, like, Muslims didn't invent the idea of the astrolabe; they just improved it, developing the the famous one that you see, the brass kind of implement with dials and things like this. But my point in this lecture is really to highlight that, in a sense, I would like to get Muslims out of looking back in the past to say how great we were. Even though I love history, I mean, I'm a history buff, and
I see that.
yes. I even participate in, you could say, medieval reenactments in Spain and Portugal, because of how the Spanish Portuguese also remember the Muslims, and so there's still this impact and so on. So, as much as I'm a history buff and I like to see these things and read these things and so on, but for me, I more like to see the mindset that the Muslims had back then. And for me, I want to reproduce, see it revive the mindset that the Muslims had, that led to these things, rather than simply just, in a way, living in the past, which I think Muslims do today. Oh, look how great we were. That's irrelevant. Look where you are now. Look where Gaza is now. Look where Kashmir is now.
I
Look where
agree with
Sudan
you.
is
What,
now.
but in the West, I mean, being a teacher in the West, being a Muslim born and raised in the West mostly, having children and grandchildren all born and raised in the West, as you mentioned earlier, if we are ignorant of who we were, and if we take the Western sort of colonialist, industrialized, you guys didn't do anything and you're not advanced now because you weren't advanced then. What's happening to our youth and our children here today, brother, is that they're not critical enough of what goes on around them because they have no concept of the past. Living in the past, of course, is not progressive in any way, and I don't think our faith, our Quran, or our Sirah have asked us to do that. To the contrary, we should be people of today. And being people of today who are not aware of our history is a problem in our current youth. And when I teach this material, I teach it as a saying, like what you said exactly. Let's understand what happened from a critical point of view, and let's figure out what mindset we need to build the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years. I teach in elementary school, so we're working towards that child becoming a grown up and having that mindset of science, technology, STEM, and how it's in our heritage to produce and develop and research. It's something we've always been good at, whether we were majorities or minorities. And in the West, obviously, we are a minority, but we're also a part of the West. Like most of us are born here, raised here. We don't even know anything about the East. So I'm agreeing with you 1,000%. But what I'm seeing is lacking in our kids and often in the parents, an understanding that the only way to progress is to be like the West. But we know very well that we need to, in Arabic, we say, al-indimag biduna faqd al-hawiya. So it's great to integrate without losing our principles. And this is what many have done when they've lived in our countries. Like, I'm from Egypt. I know a lot of people who live in Egypt who are not Muslim. They take whatever Egypt has to offer and they build on it. They don't lose their identity just because they lived in Egypt for 2, 3 decades or 2, 3 generations. So I think it's important for Muslims to train the future generation. So I'm agreeing with you 1,000%. It's not easy to do in an environment where we're often told that we weren't worth anything, and that's why we're not progressed. There are many reasons why we haven't progressed in the last 100 years, many of which you explained earlier. But I think for our youth and our children, it's important for them to have an understanding of the past in order to work towards a really amazing future. Jazakallah khair. Thank you.
Right. Well, no, as I said, yeah, sure, it's not, if it's useful for combating inferiority complexes, then in a sense, yes, but I suppose not for overdwelling in. It's really to show that, look, this is what was achieved, and it actually led to what you might call the modern world today. So clearly there was, the Muslim civilization was not one that contributed absolutely nothing to the cause to humanity's improvement. Quite the contrary, it's laid the foundation actually, and actually gave many things which are even used today, even processes used today, like removing cataracts. It hasn't really differed much till today. But it's just really that I wanted to make sure that people didn't overindulge in living in the past. And I would like to say that, in essence, in terms of for our own internal discourse and dialogues, our history is meaningless in this sense. We have to think of what's the situation now and what we should be doing for the future, as opposed to what happened in the past. So that would be, I suppose, one of the main messages I'm trying to get out there, is that it's all great and fine, and it's great in a debate, or great to combat defeatism, and great to combat inferiority complexes, but it shouldn't be used as a block for to actually look at our real world problems right now and find solutions with the same mindset that our ancestors found solutions with. So that would be my point. Okay, barakallah fiik, sister. Any other questions that have been asked, we can go through, inshallah.
All right, we have another question in the chat as well. Sorry, in the form. Muslims mostly lived under monarchies. Is this the failure of a practical application of Islamic political ideal? Because we weren't able to manifest a people-centric caliphate with accountability for 8 to 10 centuries.
Well, one of the problems in the medieval world, up until the invention of steam engines and railways, and of course planes, and now the internet, is the management of large territories of land. So when it takes a year for you to get from one part of your land to the next, you have to rely on local governors to do that, and eventually these local governors will act semi-autonomously. And at the same time is you'll get circumstances as to how do you maintain loyalty across large distances, and so different methods were used, and it's hard to get the kind of accountability you might get today, when back then the idea of, let's say Athenian democracy. So the idea of a democracy, Athenian democracy is really could only possible in the ancient and medieval world within one city. So only one city can be a democracy where everyone collaborates enrolling in some way. And Athenian democracy is different to modern democracy, by the way. In fact, modern democracy isn't technically real democracy, but it's a different discussion. So because of the nature of technology and the ability of communication, it's just not possible to have the kind of accountability that you could have over large stretches of territories. So in a sense, modern technology has made something akin to public and popular participation in shura, right? Consultation of the people, much more technologically feasible across larger distances than it ever did in the past. In fact, a caliphate, for example, the successorship to the Prophet Muhammad in ruling the Muslims is much more feasible now than it ever was in the past, because of more technology and how it allows communication over vast distances, travel. I can within the space of less than a day, I can get to one end of the Muslim world to the other on modern means. Impossible using the past. You have lands and states like China and Russia are now possible over large areas of land. The United States of America is a large land mass. It's one state with multiple states, I suppose, a federal system, but it's possible. Well, heck, you're Canadians. Canada is possible to have as one state, even though you have regional government and regional states, but it's possible because of modern technology that allows quick communication, logistics, and transportation, and so on. So the question really is that for its time, the caliphates were the most cohesive as possible for their time, and in a situation where to rule over large distances, you need to maintain loyalty. And one of the problems is that you can't have Muslim deliberation so over large distances because the communication is too long. I mean, heck, the wars between Ali anhum as a caliph and Muawiyah was because a lot of it is because the distance between Damascus and Medina you could say would naturally start to arise these problems. So this is the situation that that obviously is a circumstance that I think is now no longer a problem. Now you can have Muslims voting on policies as part of Shura in consultation with a caliph from Morocco to Malaysia in one day, and it's not a problem. Whereas that would be impossible in the medieval world because of the technological infeasibilities of that. So yeah, that's how I would answer that.
All right, thank you. We have a question in the chat. You mentioned that when the Christians were inspired by Muslims about sciences and technology, but left behind books on morals and ethics. For Muslims that grew up in the West and lack the ability to understand the Quran in the context it is in Arabic, where should we start to learn ethics, morals, and theology according to Islam, other than along with the Quran, in your opinion?
Okay, so there's a hadith. It was actually an athar, so by the Sahabas, and they said when we were young, we learned Iman. We learned Iman from the Prophet Muhammad, and then we learned the Quran. And when we heard the Quran, it only increased us in Iman. So many people say this is a reference to Bayt al-Arqam, the house of Arqam in Mecca, which was where the Prophet Muhammad was giving secret halaqat to the Sahabas that followed him, the few followers that were following him at that time, obviously compared to what would be much later on, of course. And this was a time when there's only there wasn't the verses of the Quran complete. The verses many of them were only going to come much later on. So there wasn't a lot of verses of the Quran accessible at that point in time. It hadn't been revealed to mankind at that point in time. And yet, what was he teaching them in Bayt al-Arqam? And so many scholars have said that the only way you can obviously find this, what they were being taught, is in the ijma of the Sahabas. How if all the Sahabas, all the companions of the Prophet Muhammad all agree on something, it's because this was a thing that they were all taught, basically. So this means then that simply just reading the Quran straight as a novice or someone that obviously can't speak Arabic isn't going to help you. Relying only on the translation isn't going to help you. What you need, in essence, is for those people who know it systematically, i.e., scholarship, those who are learned, will teach you in a systematic way what the Quran and Sunnah is meant to be conveying to you, basically, and you will teach it to you, will help you access it. Now, of course, one could read the Quran straight and the Sunnah straight, and if you could read it straight with Fusha Arabic, with the classical Arabic of the Quran, and studying the context of the revelations, a whole bunch of things. In essence, making yourself a scholar. Then you can do that. That would take a long, long time, and then you'd be a scholar at the end of it, right? But why we have scholars, the role of the scholars is to make it like we have teachers. The teachers don't, say, okay, well, you need to learn about science. You go do the experiments and you discover science for yourself. No, they say, look, here's what's been discovered already, and in essence, training you up until you can then read it for yourself with better understanding. So that's what scholars are here to do. They've done the hard work to make it easier for you to actually study and learn. So in essence, when you want to talk about issues like morals, ethics, and justice, Islamic solutions to these things, you're going to have to learn it from either courses or books or things like this that are made available to you. The one problem is, in this day and age, many scholars don't discuss these topics, ethics and morals, to when it pertains to dealing with societal problems. So societal problems, society's problems. It's called politics, and they stay away from politics. They don't get involved unless it's something that's quite serious. Maybe they might say something about Trump. Maybe they might not even say anything about Trump, and regarding American, let's say, Muslim scholars. But usually they stay away from these topics, and which is a symptom of the general problem in Muslim civilization as is current, which is defeatism, shying away from applying Islam holistically. So in every aspect of life's affairs, human purpose, the human purpose of life applies in every aspect of life, right? But after secularism, colonialism, and a whole bunch of isms, we've shrunk away from this, and so many scholars just want a nice, comfortable life, not risking their neck by sticking it out to talk about how Islam deals with these topics. And of course, what happens then is, of course, many youth want to change the world, right? Many of you are youngsters. You want to change the world. You want to improve it. It's natural amongst youth to do this, but your scholars aren't telling you this stuff, and so not all. I'm saying many, but many you might have access to. They don't talk about these things, so you're gonna then find books or be presented with books by Karl Marx and John Locke and Mary Wollstonecraft and a whole bunch of other people, which do talk about improving the world and morals and justice and values, not from an Islamic basis, but from a completely different basis. But it starts to give you solutions. These solutions don't always work, or they don't, or they lead to problems later on, unforeseen problems that aren't initially obvious or immediate, but people believe it and they then go wayward. And then eventually, of course, they take these ideas. Then they see, well, why isn't Islam talking about liberalism or socialism or neo-Marxism or postmodernism or whatever ism they've adopted, or conservatism in its when understood properly what conservatism actually is, and it's not Islamic, by the way. Then they have doubts, crisis of faith. Why is these human speculations on ethics and justice more guiding than the Quran and Sunnah? Well, it's not more guiding the Quran and Sunnah, but they haven't been given access to the Quran and Sunnah and in its solutions for societal problems. That's why when I probably told you about how, for example, tax on farmers are reduced by half if they irrigate their land themselves. It's probably the first time you've heard of it, but it's part of the Sunnah, right? And there are many other things that the Prophet has talked about, which you're just not taught because it's politics. And let's not talk about politics, right? Even though it's what Islam says, right? So that's part of the problem we have today. Now, you asked more specifically, your question is more specific. You want to know, where do I go, right? There are many places. One thing is I'm an instructor on the Muslim Blueprint course, as one example, by I3 Institute, which actually tried to actually make that accessible to the youth. And I would recommend it well, I mean, I am an instructor on it, of course, so of course I would, but I recommend, because we talk about specifically holistically Islam, including these aspects of Islam that unfortunately are not being taught, and it's fiqh and issues which are actually not disputed amongst classical Islamic scholarship, but they're just not talked about in modern scholarship. So subhanAllah, the classical scholarship, I actually wish all Muslims read classical Islamic scholarship, because you'd be shocked at how sophisticated and detailed it is. It just needs to be extrapolated into using modern technology, but that's the only thing that it requires to bring it up to date, should we say. So yeah. So if you haven't go to I3 Institute and Muslim Blueprint program, they offer it to students. That's one recommendation. There are also many books by many Greek thinkers of the modern world revivalists, which also try to reintroduce Muslims, especially young Muslims, to holistic Islam. in order for them, obviously, to follow what is, Islam in its totality, it's obviously what it's meant to be followed as, what it's meant to be implemented as, the solutions it brings to a desperate humanity that's really looking for real solutions that actually work. As you can already see now, the international order is a farce due to Israel and America and all this. They've shown it to be full of hypocrisy and a farce. The international rule of law, rules of war, and so on have just been rendered ridiculous now. The failure of the liberal world order. But anyway, that's a different discussion. But anyway, that's my recommendation. If you'd like, as a go-to place, only because it's being offered currently, and it tries to be holistic and it's a structured program. I'm not sure of any other institute that offers programs like this. They were more limited programs, only on Arabic language or on personal fiqh, and so on, rather than actually more about economics, macroeconomics, as well as Islamic banking and finance. But anyway, that would be my recommendation to you.
All right, thank you. Last question. What should the role of women in today's techno-industrial societies be? Also, what's the nature of women's role in civilization building from an Islamic perspective?
So this is probably a very controversial question because now, Islamically, of course, a woman doesn't have to. It's not. She doesn't go to hell if she doesn't get married. She doesn't. It's not a sin for her to open up a book and of advanced engineering and learn from it, right? And so it could be perfectly within the remit of Islam for a woman to go into higher education and study to that level, and there's no problem from an Islamic perspective for that individual. But what if everyone, if it's done en masse? Well, there are certain issues that arise in that some people have complained of or have noticed, which is the birth rates decline. Women have children later on in life, which leads to more complications in birth and so on. As opposed to having children very early on, such that they can then, by the time they reach 40, they have grown children and they can pursue whatever they want to pursue, further education or what have you, because now their children are growing up or almost grown up. Basically, they're already adults, Islamically speaking. There's also tension within familial roles, with men being head of the household, but what if the case is that the woman is more educated than the man? Can that cause problems in the marriage? I wouldn't say necessarily that would be the case, but some people have said there could be, if this was replicated en masse by became the norm, as opposed to you can have an intellectual elite group of women, but what about if all women did that? Got married later, focused on education first until they're like 30. They all had doctorates and so on, which would be great, but then birth rate goes down. Then you need to import workers and you need immigration. That's why you have immigration in the West. You have immigration in the West because declining birth rates, and so the economy will collapse unless you have people who are entering on the bottom rung and do all those hard jobs, or not intellectually hard jobs, but the manual labor jobs which are not comfortable. So those are the situations. People might say maybe high divorce rate occurs, and there's a lot of, and I'm not going to say this as in I know this for certain this is the case, because I don't. This is all, I'm only reporting to you the various arguments in public discourse that are happening currently. So what I would say is that I think that every Muslim, it's not obviously gaining knowledge, as the hadith says, an obligation on every Muslim. That means men and women are obliged to gain knowledge. But I think that the nature of the educational institutions that women should go to should be different, where a woman can actually synthesize or blend being a mother at a younger age, as well as grow her mind, expand her horizons, and obviously gain that gain a higher education if she wants to pursue that. So I think that's what really needs to be solved, is that key issue in the Muslim world, because uh, that's you're seeing now declining birth rates in the Muslim world as women are told that being a mother is not good enough. You have to be a successful career woman and bring money into the family and so on and so forth. But the other opera is extreme, is saying no, women should just stay at home and not do anything and not study these subjects and just only study motherhood, because women educate their children, right? And they have to have this knowledge to be able to educate their children, right? The more educated a woman is, the better she can educate her children. That's the next generation. So there has to be a means that women should have access to education, advanced education, to attain, if they have good intellect, especially those that have very good intellect, should be allowed to go further if they want to do that, but without having to choose between uh, early children at a younger age, 20, 22, 23, 24, 25, and education. It shouldn't be a dichotomy for women, I think. We have to resolve that. Is that Now, if you're asking the question, what should women do in terms of educate, like intellectually speaking? Generally speaking, I view men and women as parallel processes. For if anyone that knows computing, a parallel processes are more powerful in a computer. A dual core, as processes are more powerful than single core processes that are not parallel. So it's important that you don't let half of the society's processing power go to waste. Yeah, so women should be allowed to pursue knowledge, become more sophisticated like men, and go as far as possible. But it shouldn't be at the expense of motherhood at optimal ages. So that's the point. And Muslim women have a vital role in the revival of Islamic civilization as much as Muslim men. Shouldn't just be the men doing it, but women too. Because if women demand that Islam must be revived holistically, what you'll find is then more men, it will help the cause amongst men, obviously, for getting men who are ignorant to actually wake up to a holistic and purpose-driven Islam, as opposed to a cultural Islam that's just part of a list of arbitrary customs and expectations they were taught from birth, most of which are not from Islam. So that's what I'm sorry. Muslim women should be, along with men, at the forefront of revival, but and also gaining as much knowledge as possible, going as far as their intellects will take them. But there should be a resolution to the problem of the dichotomy of early motherhood should be encouraged, and women should have to choose either or, early motherhood or education. It should be early motherhood and education. So that's what I would basically. As to the solutions for that, there'll be maybe a more elaborate discussion. But that will need societal changes, so that women can actually have the ability to be young mothers and also be highly educated without having to compromise on that, basically. So yeah.
All right, thank you. I just have one last follow-up on that. What would you say was the role historically of women in Islamic civilization?
Well, I mean, what it says is, what generally is that the main thing that was encouraged for men and women was the gender roles. So men were providers; they were meant to, it's not just bring money in, but bring resources in, make a safe environment, and fight the wars and things like this. So be the protectors, maintainers, and protectors, as the Quran says. And women were expected to be, if they have children, obviously they have to be good mothers and to protect or maintain the house while the husband is away. And obviously both the man and the woman be good companions to each other. So obviously that was not just a gender role, that was the universal roles that everyone had, but complementary to each other. So how that manifested, of course, obviously would depend on this on the historical and geographical circumstances. But what happens is that you will get a percentage of men who are geniuses and are entrepreneurs and what have you, and you'll get a percentage of women that are also geniuses and also entrepreneurs or ambitious and have very good intellects. And what you'll find, and what you did find in history, is that there were women entrepreneurs, thinkers, and so on, which they were not going to be happy simply just being a wife and a mother, but they wanted to do something else. They wanted to get into business. They wanted to create awqaf, trusts that would benefit society. They wanted to do more. So what I'd say Islamic society does, and I think would be the best way of describing it, is Islamic society doesn't expect more from women than being good mothers and being good wives and good daughters and so on, and it doesn't expect more from women. So you're not a bad woman if that's you're doing those things and that's all you want to do. You're not a bad woman for doing that. You're not something. There's nothing wrong with you for being a housewife, let's say, a homemaker. Nothing wrong with you, right? That's a good wife, but a good mother and what have you. But if you want to do more than that, then no one's going to stop you, right? I think that's the approach that Islamic society had. That if you want to do more than this, so like we're not expecting to do it. No one's going to be looking at you and like, oh, you didn't do that. There's something wrong with you. But if you do it, then no one's going to stop you from doing it. Then okay, that's how it is. So this is where you could say Muslim women throughout history contributed. So one famous example is the university in Karawen in Morocco. People say it was the first university. Not technically. I mean, it depends how you define university, but it's not the first university in the world. Although it depends how you define that. But it was set up by a woman, Fatima al-Fihri, who she didn't want to just basically be a housewife and a mother only, but she wanted. She got wealth, and she wanted to invest it in an institution of learning. So, okay, then that's it. So I think this is basically how Muslim women contribute. But for those women that wanted to do more than just being homemakers and what have you, there's been obviously many great achievements that women have achieved. Advisors to sultans, caliphs. There was once female woman amongst the Sahaba who actually, she told the Prophet Muhammad that she wanted to join the army. She wasn't. Men were expected to be reservists in the army, not women, but she wanted to. So even though the Prophet Muhammad didn't command that women must join the army like men do, and they weren't expected to fight, but she really insisted. So okay, then you can join and fight. So I suppose that's the best way of describing women's place in Islamic society is you're not going to be prevented from doing beyond, you could say, the traditional female role. No one's going to prevent you. You're just not going to be expected to do it, right? So you're not going to be looked down upon if you don't go beyond that role, right? And I think that's the best way of describing it. I know your question was more, what did women contribute? But I didn't want to just name drop a bunch list of names and what have you. I wanted to really describe now what was the social conditions, which is more important. What was the social conditions? And of course, what you saw is that women generally would, for example, they would supplement the economy of their household by cottage industries, so things that making things in the house to sell. Usually, if you were in a poor rung society, both the man and the woman worked because you could, if you're in a farmer, what have you, everyone works, right? Everyone has to work, right? It's not just a lady of leisure. A woman doesn't have to do any actual work. It's only for the rich people or middle, or to some extent middle class, but not the working classes, as you might call them that. So women contributed. Sometimes they would help in farm work, and they would help with this. Maybe not the most strenuous work of the farm work, but they would work and contribute for the household. So you see those circumstances, situations occurring as the norm. Basically, women would middle class women or rich women would sometimes they would be entrepreneurs, investors, and merchants as well. But then they would get agents that would go to the markets, male agents that would employ them to buy and sell on their behalf, right? So even though they don't physically go to the marketplace themselves, I mean, they're not prevented from going, but they thought, too many guys there, whatever. I'll get an agent to go there and do my bidding on my behalf. So you have those situations documented in Ottoman times and even before it. So that's more. I want to speak more generally as to what we did. So in essence, as I said, to reduce it down to the point, which is men and women are not expected to do beyond being homemaker, wife, mother. But if they do, no one's going to stop them, and you're not going to be looked down upon for doing it, but you're not going to be looked down upon for not doing it. And I suppose that would be the best way of describing it.
Right, thank you. It was interesting. We kind of looped right back around in Islamic history, talking about how women used to have male agents who would go manage their money. Also, like the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his wife Khadija.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's the most obvious example. The Prophet's wife, Khadija radiallahu anha, was a successful merchant woman who earned more than her husband, obviously, upon when they got married, and that wasn't deemed to be, shameful. The beauty about Islam and the hikmah of this is, even if the woman earns more than the man, because it's the man's responsibility to provide for the family, so he's paying the bills. He's the one that's, in essence, protecting, maintaining that family. So then it doesn't matter if the woman has more money than him, because he's the one that is maintaining that family, not her. So there's nothing to be ashamed of. And so that's why Islam is very beautiful and how it deals with, like, human nature, especially across the genders, as well. So yeah, but that was a very obvious example from obviously early Muslim history.
All right, Jazakumullah khair, everyone, for attending. Jazakumullah khair, Ustad Abdullah, for an amazing, very informative lecture. Yes?
1 second, I see Sister Saima has a hand up. Maybe just take that as the last question then.
Oh, sorry, I did not notice that. Yes, if you have your hand up, you can.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. I don't really have a question. It was just more of a comment. And it's like, because I work in like gender equity and things like that with the government. And one major issue that people have is that double burden, right? Where women are expected to work and also mother at the same time. And I think if it would be it would be so wonderful if one day we can like share the idea that like women don't have to be expected to do both and like juggle this and put on so much pressure on themselves, right? Because it is causing so much suffering among women. And yet at the same time, women think that like being able to do both is their liberation, but it's also like a form of enslavement, right? Where they're constantly overworked, they're constantly stressed, right? So yeah, that I just think that it's a really great idea what like Islam is advocating for. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, barakallahu fikum, sister. Then I'll give a comment on your comment to give perhaps maybe that's a very good point you raise. And one of the things is, and this is where I talk about taking morals from the West. So at some point, Western philosophy developed the idea, and this is really from the socialist line of thinking, or continental philosophy, and then it became popularized, was that if you control, if you are control the money supply, let's say you're the one that, economically, people depend on you economically, then you control them and they are your slaves in some sense. So this was the socialist argument, and then that adopted. Many feminists adopted the argument, and beyond simply asking for legal equality, they said, well, women actually should be emancipated from dependence on a husband because that's enslavement. So then the idea that getting your own money is your freedom was sold as emancipation. Of course, you're enslaved to your boss, right, and your patron. Now, then people might say, well, okay, I'll be my own boss and I'll have my own business, and that's true freedom. And every woman should aim to be her own boss and be own her own company. I mean, you can't have everybody having their own company, I suppose. You have to have workers, right? But and then the socialist critique goes, then, well, then it's the capitalists, the bourgeois, they're the actual masters, and everyone's a slave. Anyway, I'm not going to go into too much in socialism, but the argument was that you're enslaved if you depend on somebody. The truth is, we all depend on other people. Women might say, I don't need a man, I'm protected. If someone broke into a house, she'd call the police, right? She doesn't actually protect herself in a house for the most part, right? Unless you're in Texas, because then everyone has guns. But generally speaking, you depend on people to make the roads you walk on, to build the buildings that you go into and have your office in. We all depend on each other. That's just how humans are. And to say that you are somehow independent and free from everybody in some way, simply because you don't have you don't trust someone to basically provide for you, is false, and also is kind of sad, actually. Whereas what it should be, what it ideally should be, is that it's the man and woman actually have a reciprocal, and obviously have a reciprocal dependency on each other. So the woman might depend on the man in Islamic perspective for protection, so he has to give his life to defend her, as well as maintenance of her, bringing resources into the house. But the man depends on the woman emotionally, right? So it keeps him mentally stable, gives him grounded. Many men have purpose because they are providers. They feel they have purpose to do so, and they need that attention, the affection that women can give. And women actually have leverage over the man using emotions, using the emotional provisions that they provide to the man. Right? Hence, women have leverage over men in a relationship, which all women know. Obviously, will know this. Obviously, that they have means of getting their way, or pushing their husband to do something they want, or what have you. Because why? Because the man has a dependency. If the man doesn't depend on you emotionally, you couldn't affect him, right? So the reality is, we all mutually depend on each other. So why don't we just focus on making a harmonious dependency, right? Rather than saying, I actually want to be independent from you, and you don't need you anymore. Because then eventually, then people then get divorced and they break up because they don't need each other anymore. The man is told, don't depend on the woman for your emotions, right? Like, you live like you're independent of her, which is what the manosphere, or what's it called, the red pill movement is about trying to say. And women are told, you don't need men for protection and for maintenance. And of course, then they don't want to get married anymore. They don't want to have a relationship. Well, they can't maintain relationships anymore after the honeymoon period dies down, because obviously the only thing is sex would be what usually bonds people together initially, or the desire for it, reproduction. But there's nothing else beyond that glues them. Once they get tired of that, they split apart. So that's the problem in the West, and that's something that Islam has the answer and solution to. And we as Muslims shouldn't be borrowing from the West and then destroying our own marriages. Instead, we should be showing them how they can actually preserve their own marriages.
All right, perfect. Thank you again, Ustad Abdullah, for an amazing and enlightening lecture. And thank you, everyone, for attending and asking very thought-provoking questions, whether it's through the forum or here in the session. And yeah, Inshallah, we will see you again when we do another lecture like this. Jazakumullah khairan and Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.